It was the summer of '05, and my family had driven down to Fort Myers, Florida, to spend our annual 2 weeks with my aunt and uncle. I was 12, excited to see my older cousin Sabrina, who was 13 and practically my sister during those summers. Every year, like clockwork, we'd spend days at the beach, getting sunburned, drinking way too much soda, and staying up past midnight sharing our biggest secrets. It was simple, safe, and predictable, at least until that summer. The first night started off normal. After a big family dinner, Sabrina and I squeezed onto the couch and watched some corny family movie, trying not to laugh too loudly at the bad jokes. When my parents went into the kitchen for a nightcap with my aunt and uncle, Sabrina nudged me and whispered, "You want to see something cool?" She had this glint in her eye, one that told me she'd been waiting all night to bring this up. I couldn't help but nod. Sabrina always had the best ideas. "There's this canal a few blocks down," she said. "Local kids swear they've seen a huge gator down there. Like huge." Now, I wasn't too thrilled about the idea of sneaking out, especially for an alligator, but Sabrina was older, braver, and frankly, way cooler than me. So, naturally, I couldn't say no. The grown-ups were still deep in conversation, and it didn't look like they'd leave the kitchen anytime soon. Sabrina and I tiptoed to the back door, slipped out quietly, and started down the street. It was warm and muggy, typical Florida summer night air, and the streets were almost deserted. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows, making every palm tree and parked car look like something out of a horror movie. But with Sabrina by my side, I pushed away any nerves. On our way to the canal, we passed the 7-Eleven, and Sabrina suggested we grab some snacks. The place was practically empty except for a bored-looking cashier who barely looked at us until we were paying. He looked up from his magazine just as Sabrina handed over a few crumpled dollar bills. "You kids should be careful out there," he said, his voice low. He looked past us, toward the empty road. "Not the best time to be walking around alone." We exchanged an awkward glance, thanked him, and headed back outside, trying to brush off his words. But something about his tone stuck with me. Still, we had a mission, and the thought of this supposedly monstrous alligator waiting in the dark was too intriguing. As we got closer to the canal, the surroundings grew quieter. The usual sounds of distant traffic and buzzing streetlights faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. We walked along a narrow path that led to the water's edge, and I noticed the grass becoming damp and the sidewalk uneven, almost like it hadn't been maintained for years. And then Sabrina froze, gripping my arm. I followed her gaze and saw him, a man, standing on the sidewalk about 30 feet ahead. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing away from us. "Maybe he's just lost," I whispered, but Sabrina shook her head. There was something off about the way he was standing, so unnaturally still, like he was listening intently. I tugged on her sleeve. "Maybe we should head back." She didn't answer, just kept staring at him. And then, slowly, almost mechanically, the man turned around to face us. I couldn't make out many details in the dim light, but I could see enough to know he was staring straight at us. He raised his arm and began to wave. It wasn't a friendly wave. It was a slow, deliberate motion, each rise and fall of his hand somehow feeling ominous. Sabrina and I exchanged another glance, and I saw fear in her eyes. We didn't say anything, we just turned and started walking back, a little faster this time, glancing over our shoulders. After a few minutes, we stopped to catch our breath, laughing nervously at ourselves for getting so spooked. "It was probably nothing," Sabrina said, trying to convince herself as much as me. But when we looked back toward the canal, he was there again, under the streetlight, maybe 10 feet closer. The light illuminated his face, and I felt my stomach twist. He looked to be in his 40s, with slick back hair and a strange, crooked nose. But it was his smile that I couldn't shake, a closed-lip grin, stretched too wide, too forced. And he was still waving, like he was trying to get us to come closer. "Run!" Sabrina whispered, her voice barely a breath. Without another word, we sprinted down the street, cutting through people's lawns, jumping over garden gnomes and bushes. I could hear Sabrina's breath coming in short gasps, and I could feel my heart pounding so hard it hurt. We ran for what felt like an eternity before we finally stumbled into our backyard, both of us breathless and drenched in sweat. The back door was locked, so we pounded on it, not caring if we got in trouble. My mom opened it, giving us a suspicious look. Sabrina blurted out something about needing snacks, and thankfully, our parents were too tipsy to ask too many questions. But that night, neither of us slept well. For weeks, the image of that man haunted me. His strange wave, his lifeless smile, and those eyes fixed on us like he was studying us. Even years later, the memory is as sharp as ever. I never went back to that canal, never snuck out again. And I don't think Sabrina did either. The summer before high school ended with a night I'll never forget. My friends Jamie, Eddie, and I were together for one last sleepover before the new school year, and we wanted to make it special. It was this unspoken understanding that things would be different after summer, that the three of us, so close through middle school, would start to drift. So, in a way, we needed one last adventure, one final memory to seal the summer. We spent most of the night huddled in Eddie's basement, talking about nothing in particular, just the stupid, random stuff kids talk about. By the time midnight rolled around, I had a wild idea. What if we go to the high school? I suggested, a little too eagerly. We could sneak out, walk to the field, lay on the grass, and look at the stars. Jamie looked at me like I was insane, but Eddie grinned. He was always up for things like that, the kind of kid who'd throw rocks at a beehive just to see what would happen. Jamie hesitated, glancing toward the stairs, probably thinking about her parents finding out. We'll be back in, like, an hour. It's not even that far, I urged, more to convince myself than them. The three of us had never done anything like that before, but the idea of one last summer adventure was too tempting. After a few minutes of hushed deliberation, we grabbed our shoes and quietly crept out the basement window. The air was cool, and there was a weird, electric feeling in it, like the night had been waiting for us. We walked in silence for the first part, giggling at how quiet everything was, the way the empty streets seemed strange without the daylight. Eventually, we started talking again, recounting every stupid thing we'd done that summer. Eddie had this habit of using way too many hand gestures, and Jamie and I kept shushing him, afraid someone might hear us. When we finally reached the high school, the place looked enormous and weirdly haunting in the dark, all these familiar buildings now looming shadows. We hopped over the short fence and lay down on the grass, watching the stars overhead. They were beautiful, scattered across the sky like spilled sugar. I remember feeling so small, just lying there with my friends, each of us quietly wrapped in our own thoughts. An hour must have passed, maybe a little more. Jamie checked her watch and gave me a nudge. We should probably get back. Her voice had a hint of worry in it, like she could feel the edge of trouble creeping into the night. We reluctantly got up, brushed the grass off our clothes, and headed back. The way home was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet where you start to notice the sounds your own feet make, the rustling of leaves, even your own breathing. When we turned the corner onto the main street, we spotted a car parked at the intersection, just sitting there under the stop sign. It was an old, white Mustang, its paint chipped and worn, the kind of car that seemed out of place in our small town. Eddie, of course, couldn't resist making some dumb joke about it. Maybe it's a ghost car, coming to take us away, he whispered in his best spooky voice. Jamie rolled her eyes, but I couldn't help feeling unsettled, like something was off. As we passed by, something changed. The Mustang's headlights flicked on, and the car suddenly lurched forward, making a sharp U-turn, tires squealing. The engine roared to life, and before we knew it, the car was racing toward us. We froze, caught between fear and disbelief. Eddie was the first to react, yelling, "Run!" We took off down a side street, adrenaline pumping, our footsteps pounding against the pavement. I could hear the car behind us, gaining ground. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows as we ran, each step echoing in my ears. My heart felt like it was going to burst. We turned another corner and veered onto a narrow dirt road, hoping to lose them in the dark. The car screeched to a stop behind us, and I dared a glance over my shoulder. Two men stepped out, their silhouettes menacing under the streetlight. One of them held a long metal pipe, swinging it like a baseball bat as he scanned the area. "Where are you, little punks?" one of them snarled, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. His voice had this terrifying, cold rage to it, like he wasn't just mad, he wanted to hurt us. We darted into the trees lining the dirt road, crouching low to the ground, barely breathing. Jamie squeezed my hand so tight it hurt, but I didn't dare pull away. I could hear Eddie next to me, trying to control his breathing. We were so close, they could have heard us if we weren't careful. The men split up, one circling to the left, the other heading right, muttering threats and taunts. "We'll find you," one of them hissed. "Come out now, make it easy on yourselves." I don't know how long we hid there. It felt like hours. I was terrified to even blink, afraid any movement would give us away. I could feel Jamie shaking beside me, her breath coming in tiny, shallow gasps. Eddie somehow managed to stay stone still, though I could feel the fear radiating off him. The guy with the pipe was getting closer, close enough that I could see the glint of metal under the moonlight. He took another step, and then another, until he was practically standing over us. I shut my eyes, waiting for him to see us, waiting for the nightmare to begin. But then, his friend called out, "Forget it. They're gone." He sounded annoyed, almost bored, like we weren't worth the effort. After a moment of hesitation, the guy with the pipe grunted in frustration and turned back toward the car. We stayed there, unmoving, until we heard the Mustang's engine start up again. The headlights flashed, and the car slowly pulled away, disappearing into the night. We didn't speak, didn't even look at each other for a long time. When we finally dared to stand, our legs were wobbly, as if we'd forgotten how to walk. We stumbled our way back to Eddie's, each of us too shaken to say anything. 2 days later, we found out the white Mustang had been stolen from a nearby town and was linked to a string of robberies. It was all over the news. Seeing the car on the screen made my stomach twist. Those men weren't just messing around, they were dangerous. They could have hurt us, maybe even killed us. That night, lying in my bed, I kept replaying everything in my mind, trying to understand how close we'd come to real danger. It was supposed to be just another night, one last summer adventure. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of the town around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that we'd crossed some invisible line into a world that wasn't safe, wasn't innocent. That trip was supposed to be a quiet escape into the snowy wilderness, a break from everything I'd left behind in the city. It was just me, my skis, and a cozy cabin I'd rented in the Adirondacks. The cabin was small, private, and buried in a dense forest that blanketed everything in soft silence. The snowstorm wasn't supposed to hit until my last day. I'd checked the weather obsessively, and it looked like I'd have 3 days of clear skies before the worst of the storm settled in. But as luck would have it, the storm came early. The snow began falling hard the second night, and by dawn, it was a full-on blizzard, trapping me in a white abyss. The first morning of the storm, I woke up to the sound of a knock at the door. Now, let me clarify, this cabin was isolated. The nearest sign of civilization was a long, winding road, which had been impassable since the snow started. So the idea that someone had trekked through a snowstorm to reach my cabin? It didn't make any sense. I was wary, but the knocking continued, insistent, almost pleading. I opened the door, and there she was, a woman, maybe mid-40s, with a face drained of color. She was wearing a thin jacket, far too light for the kind of cold we were facing, and her hair clung to her face, half frozen, her expression dazed and exhausted. "I'm lost," she said in a voice that trembled as much from fear as from cold. I rented a cabin nearby, but I couldn't find it in the storm. Something about her looked genuinely helpless, so I invited her in. She introduced herself as Lydia, and she told me she'd wandered for hours, unsure of where she was. She'd rented her cabin through Airbnb, just like I had. but as the snow piled up, she couldn't make sense of her directions. I let her rest on the sofa, gave her a blanket, and offered her some tea. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't uneasy, though. This woman showing up out of nowhere was strange, but I told myself she just needed a place to warm up. Barely an hour later, there was another knock. This time, it was a man. His name was Owen, and he had the same story. He'd rented a cabin nearby, lost his way, and found himself wandering through the snowstorm. He was pale, shivering uncontrollably, and looked as though he'd been out there for far longer than Lydia had. I brought him inside, too, gave him some tea, and he sank onto the sofa next to Lydia, too cold to say much of anything for the first few minutes. As the day wore on, the snow kept falling, thickening into a wall of white that covered every window. Lydia and Owen warmed up slowly, and as they did, they both relaxed. Their stories were oddly similar. Both had booked Airbnb cabins somewhere nearby but had no idea where exactly. Both had wandered in the storm for hours, and both were alone on their trips. As the hours passed, I started to notice something a bit off about Lydia and Owen. They'd been cold and desperate when they arrived, but now, as they sat across from me, their expressions became hard to read. A faint smile would flicker across Lydia's lips, or Owen would glance my way with an intensity that made me uneasy. It was subtle, nothing I could point to exactly, but something in the way they sat and watched me felt strange. Night fell, and the storm outside grew worse. I knew there was no way for any of us to leave, so I offered Lydia and Owen a place to stay for the night. I set up blankets and pillows on the sofa for them and turned in early, though sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud thud. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a branch falling outside, but then I heard another sound, the door creaking open. My heart dropped. I got out of bed quietly and peered down the hallway. The front door was open, snow swirling in, and Lydia and Owen were gone. The storm was still raging, and as I stared out into the snow, I spotted two figures standing a little distance from the cabin. Lydia was holding a bag, my bag, the one I'd left by the front door. Standing next to her was a third person. I couldn't see his face, but I could tell he was taller, broader than Owen. Panic surged through me. What were they doing with my bag? Who was that third person? I stepped back, trying to collect my thoughts, when suddenly, I heard the bedroom door behind me click shut. Slowly, I turned back toward my room, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the snow outside. Someone was in there. I could hear faint footsteps, the creak of the floorboards just beyond the door. My mind raced. Was it Owen? But if Owen was inside, then who was outside with Lydia? Heart pounding, I grabbed my boots and jacket and bolted for the front door, not daring to look back. The snow was relentless, but adrenaline kept me moving. I scrambled into my Jeep, the engine struggling in the freezing temperatures. I didn't stop to think, didn't look back to see if anyone was following me. I just drove, pushing through the snow, knowing I'd left my gear, my food, and everything behind. When I finally made it to a main road, I pulled over, hands still trembling. I tried to convince myself that they were just two lost travelers. But the more I thought about it, the more certain I was that something darker was at play. The way Lydia and Owen had just appeared, one after the other, in the middle of nowhere. The way they'd watched me, calm and steady, as if they were waiting for something. And the third figure, the one who'd been standing outside with my bag. It was 2013, a warm October night, and I remember lying on my bed, eyes wide open and restless. My mom thought I was asleep by 11 p.m., but instead, I was plotting an escape. I'd planned this night for weeks with my best friend, Nate. Nate was one of those kids who could stay out as late as he wanted. No curfew, no strict parents. For him, curfews were just myths that other kids had to follow, so of course, he was all in on the idea of exploring an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. We'd been daring each other to do it all summer, and now, just days before Halloween, it felt like the perfect time. Around midnight, I slipped out of my window, careful not to make a sound, and jogged my bike down the street until I reached the corner where Nate was waiting. Together, we pedaled through the quiet streets under a cloudy sky, feeling invincible. I remember the way the air smelled, kind of damp, with a hint of fallen leaves and a chill that crept into my bones. The old hospital had been abandoned for years, left to rot after it closed suddenly in the late 90s. The story was that the funding had run out, and it just wasn't worth saving. No one ever bothered to tear it down, though, so it became this looming, empty husk of a place, always casting a shadow on the nearby suburbs. Kids at school told all kinds of stories about it, that it was haunted, that strange rituals happened there, or that it was home to a group of squatters who didn't take kindly to trespassers. It all sounded ridiculous, but we were intrigued. We got there and parked our bikes under a clump of overgrown trees near the back of the property, hiding them in the shadows. The place looked even creepier in person. Crumbling bricks, shattered windows, ivy clawing up the walls. It was like the building itself had decayed into something alive, something that might swallow us whole. We found a broken basement window around the side and decided it was our best way in. Climbing through, we were hit by the thick, stale smell of the place. Dust, mold, and something else I couldn't place. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing old storage rooms lined with shelves of empty bottles, rusted gurneys, and the occasional pile of debris. The whole basement felt frozen in time, like a place where no one had been in years. We made our way up a set of creaky stairs, and as we reached the main floor, something strange happened. We noticed that some of the hallway lights were still on. They flickered occasionally, casting eerie, broken shadows across the walls. It was strange because there was no power to the building, at least, there shouldn't have been. I glanced at Nate, and he shrugged, trying to act unbothered, but I could tell he was on edge. We moved quietly down the hall, passing by rooms that had once been patient wards, nurses' stations, and common areas. Most of the furniture was gone, like they tried to clear the place out, but the dust-free floors made me wonder if someone, or something, had been taking care of it. I brushed the thought away, focusing on the thrill of discovery. Then we saw it, a door that was locked. It was strange, because none of the other doors had been locked, and patient rooms typically didn't have locks. My curiosity got the better of me, and I leaned close, pressing my ear to the door. That's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound, like soft shuffling or a whisper. My heart leapt into my throat, and I motioned for Nate to listen too. He looked at me, eyes wide, and I could see he'd heard it too. "Maybe there's a window," he whispered, nodding to the room next door. We slipped inside the adjoining room, hoping to get a glimpse of whatever was in that locked room. As luck would have it, there was a small hole in the wall, just large enough to see through, as if someone had chipped away at the plaster long ago. I crouched down, pressing my eye to the hole. For a moment, I couldn't see anything. The room was dim, the air inside feeling stale and heavy even from where I was standing. And then, she came into view, a woman in a long, white dress, her back against the wall, looking down at the floor. Her hair was dark, hanging over her face, obscuring her features. She was completely still, like a statue, but something about her felt off. I motioned for Nate, trying to keep my breathing steady. "Look," I whispered, handing him the spot. He peered through the hole, and I watched as his face drained of color. "What the hell?" he mouthed, pulling back, his eyes wide. Despite the icy fear clawing at me, I looked again, half expecting her to be gone, to have imagined her. But she wasn't gone. She had moved. She was standing closer now, just a foot away from the hole, her face still obscured by her hair. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Then, as if sensing me, she lifted her head, turning directly towards the hole. For the briefest second, we locked eyes, and I was paralyzed, unable to move or look away. Her eyes were empty, hollow, and a terrible, twisted smile spread across her face, stretching too wide, like a grotesque grin that shouldn't have been possible. I stumbled back, falling against the wall, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Nate grabbed my arm, his face pale and scared. "We have to get out of here," he hissed, and I didn't need any convincing. We sprinted down the hallway, the lights flickering more erratically now, as if the whole place was alive and watching us, mocking our terror. I swear I heard footsteps behind us, soft but getting closer, like she was right there, just out of sight, following us. We didn't stop until we reached the basement, squeezing back through the broken window. The second we hit the outside air, I felt a rush of relief, like a weight had been lifted, but we didn't stop running. We raced back to our bikes, barely pausing before we took off down the road, pedaling as fast as we could back towards town. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. Whatever we'd seen in there, we both knew it was real. When we finally made it back to Nate's place, we slumped against the garage wall, gasping for air, too shaken to process what had happened. Nate's parents were out for the night, so there was no one to notice us, to ask us what was wrong, to assure us we hadn't just witnessed something impossible. We parted ways after a few minutes, and I rode home alone, feeling exposed under the open sky. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see her standing on the sidewalk, that awful grin on her face. Once I got home, I climbed back through my window and lay in bed, staring at the ceiling until dawn. I told myself over and over it wasn't real, that it was just an illusion, a trick of the light, that the fear had made us see things that weren't there. But deep down, I knew the truth. The woman in the white dress, she was real. And somehow, I had the feeling that she knew me, or would remember me if I ever returned. After that night, Nate and I never spoke about what happened in the hospital again. It became an unspoken pact, a shared nightmare we both experienced but were too afraid to confront. And even now, sometimes, late at night, I find myself looking out my window, expecting to see her standing there, waiting, with that twisted grin. We lived in a small apartment on the north side of Chicago. Nothing fancy, just your typical cozy place with worn carpets, creaky floorboards, and windows that rattled on windy days. Our family wasn't large, just my dad, my mom, my little sister Jenna, and me. Dad's the kind of person who would give you the shirt off his back if you asked. It's one of the reasons I admire him so much, but that night, it was his kindness that brought a stranger into our home, and with him, a chilling encounter that still keeps me up some nights. It started with Dad doing some last-minute Thanksgiving shopping. We thought we'd planned everything, but as usual, something got missed. This time, it was cranberry sauce and a few other essentials. So, Dad pulled on his jacket and headed out, promising to be back before we even noticed. He was gone longer than expected, though, and when he finally came back, he wasn't alone. A tall man in a worn-out coat with a scruffy beard stood by his side, shifting his weight uncomfortably. His name was Andrew, Dad said, explaining that he'd met him outside the store. From the way he talked, Andrew seemed like he might have been homeless. Dad had struck up a conversation, and when he found out Andrew had nowhere to go for Thanksgiving, he invited him to join us. That's just the kind of guy my dad is. Mom looked a bit unsure at first. I could see the hesitation in her eyes as she sized Andrew up. But she nodded and smiled, welcoming him in. Jenna and I exchanged uneasy glances, but we didn't say anything. Maybe we were just being judgmental, we thought. Besides, Thanksgiving is all about kindness and gratitude, right? As the evening went on, Andrew's behavior grew stranger. He barely spoke, just mumbled a few words here and there. When we all sat down to eat, he hunched over his plate, shoveling food into his mouth without looking up. Bits of mashed potato and stuffing clung to his beard, and he didn't seem to care. He ate with an unsettling intensity, almost like he hadn't eaten in days. I tried to look away, but it was hard to ignore the way he devoured everything in front of him. Once or twice, I caught him glancing at me, his eyes dark and hollow, like he was studying me. It sent chills down my spine, but I forced myself to keep eating, not wanting to make a scene. My dad tried to engage him in conversation, but Andrew just nodded or gave short, curt answers, his voice barely a whisper. I could tell Dad was getting a bit frustrated, but he didn't let it show. After dinner, Andrew asked to use the bathroom. Mom showed him where it was, and he shuffled down the hall, his steps heavy and slow. We waited for him to come back, but 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, my mom got up to check on him, knocking gently on the bathroom door. There was no response. She knocked again, and when there was still no answer, she opened the door, only to find the bathroom empty. Confused, we searched the apartment, but there was no sign of him. Then, we noticed that the window in my parents' bedroom was open, letting in a gust of icy November air. Andrew must have climbed out and disappeared into the night. We tried to brush it off, though the whole situation felt unsettling. Maybe he was embarrassed and decided to slip out without saying goodbye. Whatever the reason, he was gone, and we tried to enjoy what was left of our Thanksgiving night. After cleaning up, we all went to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept replaying the strange look in Andrew's eyes, the way he'd watched me during dinner. Around 2 a.m., I was lying in bed, drifting in and out of sleep, when I heard it, a faint, raspy breathing. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a leftover trace of anxiety from the evening. But the breathing grew louder, closer, like someone was standing right next to my bed. My heart pounded as I forced myself to open my eyes, and there, in the dim light, I saw him. Andrew was standing in the corner of my room, his shadowed figure barely visible, but his eyes, they glinted with a malevolent spark that froze me in place. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. He moved closer, and I could feel his presence looming over me, his cold hand pressing down on my neck, pinning me to the bed. His grip was firm but not painful, more like he was testing my reaction, savoring my fear. My mind raced as I tried to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. He had left. I had seen him leave. And yet, here he was, in my room, his face twisted into a grotesque smile that sent waves of terror through me. Somehow, I found my voice and let out a scream, thrashing against his grip. The noise must have startled him, because he released me, taking a step back. I scrambled out of bed, dashing into the hallway, my voice hoarse as I called for my parents. They came running, groggy and confused, but by the time they reached my room, Andrew was gone. We searched the apartment again, every closet, every corner, but there was no sign of him. The front door was still locked, and there was no open window this time. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The police came, taking our statements and searching the area, but they found nothing. They said Andrew was probably just a troubled man, someone who needed help, but I could see the unease in their faces. They didn't believe their own words any more than we did. After that night, things changed. My dad stopped inviting strangers over, and our family became more guarded, more wary of the kindness we once gave so freely. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow that flickered in the corners of my vision, reminded me of that night, of Andrew's cold, dark eyes watching me from the corner of my room. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't screamed, if I had just lain there, paralyzed with fear. Would he have stayed longer, his grip tightening around my neck? Would he have done something worse? The questions haunt me, lingering in the back of my mind, a reminder of the dangers that can lurk behind a friendly face. When I was about 12, my older brother Ethan and I loved going out in the snow, especially during those heavy winter storms that made everything feel mysterious and still. We lived just on the edge of a thick forest, and we knew every winding path, every little nook and hidden clearing. Snowstorms were like a magical reset button, covering everything in a fresh, soft blanket, and to us, it felt like a new playground every time. One night, there was a blizzard raging, thick sheets of snow blowing around us like a frosty curtain. Our parents, surprisingly relaxed, let us go outside to play in the storm. We figured it'd be the perfect night to play hide and seek. In a way, the footprints made the game even more challenging. You'd think the footprints would give away hiding spots, but in the chaos of blowing snow, they were quickly covered. I volunteered to be the one hiding first, turning off my flashlight once I ducked down between two massive pine trees. The snow was deep there, and I was able to tuck myself into the shadows, keeping still and silent. I tried clumsily to kick snow over my tracks, but there was no way to cover them all. I spotted the soft glow of Ethan's flashlight in the distance, growing closer, casting faint beams of light through the trees. He was getting close. Too close. Instead of letting him catch me, I made a quick decision to run deeper into the woods, ducking and weaving through the trees. The wind was howling, masking the crunch of my steps, and soon I was sure I'd lost him. I paused, catching my breath, turning in a slow circle. The snow fell so heavily it was like the world had closed in, soundless and isolating. For a brief second, I felt like I was alone in a world all my own. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed another set of footprints in the snow. They were fresh, much fresher than I expected. I thought they might be Ethan's, that maybe he'd circled around somehow without me noticing. But as I looked closer, I saw these were boot prints. Not Ethan's small tracks, but large, heavy prints pressing deep into the snow. My heart skipped a beat, but I kept following, thinking maybe I'd find a hunter, or, in a naive flash, even Santa Claus. The prints led me to a strange lump in the snow, barely noticeable under the swirling white, but something about it felt wrong. I approached slowly, drawn by a strange sense of curiosity and dread. I brushed snow off the lump and felt something solid under my fingers. As I cleared more of the snow away, a black plastic bag began to emerge from the pile. It was large, thick, and the more snow I moved, the stronger a foul, nauseating stench hit me, sour and rotten. A sense of panic gripped me, but I couldn't stop myself. My hands shook as I ripped open the bag, my fingers digging into the cold plastic. What I saw inside will haunt me forever. There was a body in that bag. Pale, bloated skin, lifeless eyes staring out from a sunken face, partially decayed. I was frozen, horror gripping me, while rising in my throat. I staggered back, gagging, my hands trembling so hard I couldn't even close the bag again. That was when I heard footsteps, crunching softly in the snow. I jerked up to see a beam of light cutting through the snowflakes, and relief flooded through me as I realized it was Ethan's flashlight. He'd found me, but my relief was short-lived. I gestured wildly for him to stop, to stay back, and he slowed down, his face puzzled and worried. But he ignored my frantic motions and kept walking towards me. By the time he was next to me, I was whispering urgently, "We have to go, Ethan. We have to get out of here." He didn't understand at first, but when he looked down and saw the bag, his face went as white as the snow around us. He gasped, clamping a hand over his mouth as he registered what was in front of him. Then, with a quick, firm grip, he took my arm, turned us around, and started guiding me back through the trees. His movements were quiet but tense, his body tense as he scanned the woods around us. He kept the flashlight low, just enough to see the path without drawing too much attention. Then, we both heard it, a soft, steady crunching of footsteps behind us. We both froze, and slowly, as if moving in a trance, we turned around. About 50 feet away, just at the edge of the flashlight's glow, stood a man. His face was hidden under a hood, and he stood unnaturally still, like he was watching us, waiting. Panic took over. Ethan grabbed my hand and whispered, "Run!" We bolted, tearing through the woods, running blindly, our only goal to get away from whatever horror we'd stumbled upon. The footsteps behind us grew faster, heavier, as if the person was running too. We didn't dare look back again. I could feel my breath catching in my throat, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might give us away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we burst out of the trees, the light of our house glowing faintly through the snow. We sprinted to the door, throwing it open and slamming it shut behind us. We shouted for our parents, babbling about what we'd seen, stumbling over each other's words. They were horrified but calm. They called the police immediately, and we watched as they spoke to the dispatcher, describing what we'd found. The police arrived within minutes, trudging through the snow with flashlights and radioing for more units. They asked us question after question, but we were too shaken to answer much. Ethan tried to explain where we'd found the body, giving them directions as best as he could. But by the time they went out there with searchlights, there was nothing. No body, no footprints, just endless, freshly fallen snow covering every trace. The police came back the next day to search in the daylight, asking Ethan and me to come along and show them where we'd been. We did our best, retracing our steps, but the place felt different, altered, like someone had erased the night before. They never found the body, and after a few more days of searching, they closed the case. I still get chills when I think back to that day, even though it's been almost a year now. I've always loved mountain biking, especially on the forest trails near my hometown in western Massachusetts. The quiet of the woods, the crunch of gravel beneath my tires, the occasional rush of spotting a deer or fox darting across the trail, it's always been a kind of peaceful, solitary escape for me. But that day, something happened that made me reconsider the kinds of trails I'll venture down alone. It was late September, and the leaves were just beginning to change, giving the forest that golden, eerie glow you only see in New England. A friend of mine, Evan, had told me about this hidden trail out past the main loop of Hemlock Woods, a place he and a few other riders had tried a couple of times. According to him, it was tricky to navigate but worth the challenge if I was up for an adventure. I'd left home early that morning, packed light, just my water bottle, a couple of granola bars, and a small flashlight I always kept in my backpack, just in case. I remember the air being brisk but fresh, the kind that fills your lungs with a crispness that makes you feel like you could bike for miles without getting tired. The first part of the ride went smoothly, just the usual trails I'd biked hundreds of times. I passed a few other riders and hikers, nodded at them, and felt a quiet thrill as I veered off the main path to take on Evan's hidden trail. It was secluded, winding through tighter trees, and soon I realized I hadn't seen anyone for quite a while. At first, it was amazing, the thick, tall hemlocks surrounding me on either side, casting dappled shadows across the trail. The forest had that smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, an odd but comforting scent that comes with early autumn. I felt almost like I'd entered a different world, a place lost in time. But about an hour in, I started feeling tired, and that's when things began to change. I pulled over to take a sip of water and catch my breath, realizing that I'd probably gone a bit farther than I'd intended. I checked my phone for the time and noticed I had 0 bars of reception. That wasn't unusual this far out, but it made me feel a bit uneasy. Deciding it was time to turn back, I tried to retrace my path. But the trail, which had seemed clear on my way in, now felt like it was branching off in directions I didn't recognize. The trees all looked the same, thick with gnarled branches and patches of moss that blurred together. Panic started to creep in. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down, reminding myself that I just needed to backtrack. I went left, then right, then left again, but nothing looked familiar. I remember standing there, feeling a strange sense of disorientation, like the forest was rearranging itself around me. It was then that I noticed her for the first time. I saw her through the trees, an older woman, maybe in her late 60s, with thin, graying hair pulled back in a loose bun. She wore a long, dark dress that seemed out of place in the woods, and she was just standing there, about 20 feet off the trail, watching me. I don't know how to describe it, but there was something unsettling about the way she stood so still, her eyes fixed on me in a way that felt wrong. I waved and called out to her, asking if she knew which way the main trail was, but she didn't respond. She just kept staring. Her expression was blank, her face pale against the dark trees. Finally, after a few long moments, she raised her hand and pointed, not down the path I'd come from, but deeper into the woods. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I was desperate to find my way out, so I nodded in thanks and started pedaling in the direction she'd pointed. I must have ridden for about 10 minutes, winding deeper into the forest, and then I stopped. Nothing looked right. I was more lost than before, and my gut told me that something was very, very wrong. That's when I saw her again. This time, she was closer, maybe only 10 feet away, just off the trail, her face still blank and expressionless. It was impossible. I'd been moving quickly, there was no way she could have gotten ahead of me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe there was a second trail, and she'd just taken a shortcut, But then why wouldn't she speak? I didn't dare call out this time. I just kept moving, my heart pounding. But every time I thought I was getting somewhere, every time I rounded a corner or veered down what looked like a path, she'd appear again. Always standing still, watching, her eyes cold and empty. It was as if she was guiding me further into the maze of trails, deeper into the forest. It was getting darker now, the trees casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and move in the fading light. I was completely lost, and a creeping sense of dread filled me. I felt trapped, like the forest was closing in on me. My breathing grew shallow, and each crackle of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. Then I heard her laugh. It was soft, almost like a whisper carried on the wind, but it echoed in the silence around me, chilling me to my core. I was done. I dropped my bike, leaving it where it fell, and started running. The laughter grew louder, following me, mingling with the sound of my own labored breathing. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes? Hours? It felt endless. But just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw a flicker of light through the trees, a porch light, hanging above the door of a small cabin. I stumbled toward it, barely able to stand, and banged on the door. An older man, maybe in his 70s, opened the door, his face creased with concern when he saw my state. I remember stammering something about being lost, about the woman, but I must have been incoherent because he quickly ushered me inside and sat me down, offering me a glass of water. When I finally managed to catch my breath, I told him what had happened, expecting him to tell me I was imagining things. But as I spoke, his expression grew more serious, and when I mentioned the woman, he turned pale. "You're not the first," he said quietly, glancing out the window as if expecting to see her there. "3 people have disappeared in these woods in the past month. Each one saw her." He wouldn't say much more after that, just that the local police had searched the woods but found no trace of the missing people. He offered to drive me home, and I didn't argue. When we left, I glanced back at the woods, half expecting to see her standing there at the edge of the trees. But there was nothing, only shadows. I went back the next day with Evan, hoping to retrieve my bike. We found the trailhead easily enough, but no matter how many paths we tried, we couldn't find the spot where I'd left my bike. It was as if the forest had swallowed it up, as if the trail itself had disappeared. To this day, I don't know who or what that woman was. I've tried to forget her, to push the memory into the back of my mind. But sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear that faint, chilling laugh, echoing somewhere in the distance. And I know I'll never set foot in those woods again. I was with my friend, Asher, and we had planned to hit Best Buy, scope out a good deal on laptops before the Black Friday chaos kicked in. You know, just browsing, comparing prices. Nothing out of the ordinary. But looking back now, I wish I'd trusted my gut from the start. When we walked into Best Buy, the place was packed. Crowds of people browsing TVs, laptops, phones. It was the usual pre-Black Friday crowd. Asher and I split up after a while. He went to check out some headphones, and I made my way over to the laptop section. I'd been standing there a minute, scanning the display models, when a man in a blue polo shirt walked up to me. I assumed he was an employee, maybe trying to make a sale, and smiled politely. He seemed about my age, maybe a bit older, and had an overly eager look in his eyes, like he was just waiting for me to talk. "Hey there! Looking for a laptop?" he asked, too enthusiastically. "Yeah, just checking out a few options," I replied, keeping my tone casual. "Oh, well, I could definitely help you out with that. Do you prefer a specific brand?" He leaned in a bit, his eyes focusing a little too intensely. Not really. Just looking around." I took a small step back, feeling a hint of discomfort. His eyes were a little too bright, his attention a little too focused. But I brushed it off as him just being overly eager. Maybe he was new to the job. He kept asking questions, first about specs and brands, which I answered with minimal detail, and then they got personal. Too personal. "So, do you come here often?" he asked with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. No, just whenever I need something, I replied, now shifting uneasily. Something about him was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. So, are you local? His eyes lingered on me, and I could feel the air get thicker. At that point, I looked around, trying to spot Asher, but he was still on the other side of the store. Yeah, listen, I should go catch up with my friend, I said, attempting to end the conversation. Oh, don't worry, I'm just here to help, he said, brushing it off as if he hadn't caught the hint. The way he was looking at me, it was like he was trying to read me, to memorize every detail of my face. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, but I didn't want to make a scene, so I just smiled tightly, muttered a polite thanks, and backed away. I found Asher near the headphones section and immediately told him about the interaction. He brushed it off, saying maybe the guy was just weirdly friendly, but I could tell he sensed my discomfort. Come on, he said. Let's grab a bite somewhere. I'm starving, and this place is getting way too crowded. We ended up at a nearby diner, sitting at a booth in the back. I started to relax, chalking up the experience to a random, uncomfortable interaction. But that peace didn't last. We were halfway through our meal when I noticed someone sitting at the bar, just a few feet away. It was the guy from Best Buy. He was alone, hunched over a drink, staring straight ahead. My stomach dropped. Asher noticed the change in my expression and followed my gaze. Is that? He trailed off. Yes, I whispered, not daring to look his way again. Maybe it's a coincidence, Asher said, trying to stay calm. Maybe he just happened to come here too. But I knew better. There were plenty of other places he could have gone to. The odds of him picking this exact diner? They seemed way too low. We quickly finished up and decided to leave. Asher offered to drive me home, and I gladly accepted. I didn't want to be alone, not after seeing him there. Once we got to my apartment, I invited Asher to stay over. I wasn't scared, exactly, just unsettled. We settled in, watched a movie, and tried to laugh off the weirdness of the day. Asher was a comforting presence, and I was finally starting to feel normal again. We went to bed, him on the couch and me in my room, and I drifted off, thinking it was all over. Then, around 2 a.m, I heard a tapping sound. It started off faint, barely noticeable, but gradually got louder. It was coming from the living room window. At first, I thought it might be a tree branch or maybe an animal outside, but then it happened again, louder, more deliberate, like someone was trying to get attention. My heart started pounding. I tiptoed out of my bedroom and into the dark living room, where Asher was already sitting up, looking just as alarmed as I was. We shared a silent look, and he mouthed, "Did you hear that?" I nodded, fear creeping into my chest. We waited, barely breathing, as the tapping continued, rhythmic, insistent. Then it stopped. For a long moment, there was just silence. But just as I thought we were safe, we saw it, a shadow outside the window. Someone was out there, standing close enough that we could see the outline of their figure. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I knew who it was. "Asher, that's him," I whispered, gripping his arm tightly. We didn't dare move, hoping he'd go away. But then he did something that sent a chill down my spine. The figure leaned in close to the glass, pressing his forehead against it as if trying to see inside. And then, as if sensing our presence, he started tapping again, his fingers rapping against the glass in an unnerving rhythm. Asher grabbed his phone and called the police, whispering our situation and address. We huddled there in the dark, our eyes locked on the window, waiting for the police to arrive. When the flashing lights finally appeared outside, the figure darted away into the shadows. The police came in, checked the area, and found no trace of him. Just when we thought they'd found nothing, one of the officers pointed to the window. A blue Best Buy shirt was draped over the window ledge, held in place by something heavy, a rock maybe. Attached to it was a note scrawled in a messy, almost childlike handwriting. "I'm always here to help." A shiver ran down my spine. The officer's face turned grim as he read the note, and he looked at us with a mix of sympathy and worry. We explained what had happened earlier at Best Buy, how he'd followed us, how he'd shown up here. The officer told us he'd do everything he could, but without knowing who the man was, there wasn't much they could do other than file a report. "What about Best Buy?" Asher asked, still shaken. "Don't they have employee records?" The officer shook his head. "That's the thing. We checked, and they said they don't have anyone on staff that matches that description. Whoever he was, he wasn't an employee." The blood drained from my face as the reality set in. This man had pretended to work at Best Buy, followed us to the diner, and then to my home. And he'd left a message that sounded more like a threat than anything else. The officer suggested I press charges, but I declined. I didn't want to be dragged through a long, drawn-out process. I just wanted it to be over. That night, I packed a bag and went home with Asher. I spent the next few days at his place, too afraid to go back to my apartment alone. It all started when I was scrolling through a local app, one of those online marketplaces where people list things they're giving away or selling. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just killing time, but something caught my eye, a listing for a free Trek mountain bike. It looked like it was in great condition, almost new. I didn't really need a bike, but a free Trek? I figured I'd at least reach out and see if it was still available. The poster's name was Calvin, and he responded almost immediately. His messages were friendly but a bit vague. I asked about the bike's condition, and he assured me it was in perfect shape. Then I asked him for an address, but instead of giving me one, he sent me GPS coordinates. Calvin explained that he was staying in a cabin out in the woods, somewhere he liked to go on weekends to get away from it all. Something about that made me pause. It seemed unconventional, to say the least. I considered backing out, but the lure of that shiny, free bike was strong. I thought, what's the worst that could happen? The next Saturday, I decided to make the drive out. It was about 45 minutes from my place, further into the countryside than I'd ever really gone. As I got closer, my GPS led me off the main roads and onto smaller, winding paths surrounded by thick woods. Eventually, I had to park my car and follow the coordinates on foot. There was no cell service by that point, but I told myself it was fine. I'd grab the bike and be out of there in no time. As I started walking, the forest seemed to grow denser, almost oppressive. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. I tried messaging Calvin to let him know I was nearby, but my texts wouldn't go through. I attempted to call him, nothing. My phone showed no service, and my unease grew. I should have just turned around then, but I told myself I'd come this far. It was silly to leave empty-handed. When I reached the coordinates, there was no cabin. In fact, there was nothing at all but trees and silence. No path, no signs of life, just dense woods. My stomach dropped. I felt a chill run down my spine and turned to head back the way I came. But something made me stop, a faint rustling noise, just out of sight. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but the sound didn't fade. It seemed to follow me as I started to walk faster, heading back toward the road. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there. When I finally broke through the tree line and saw my car, I felt a rush of relief, until I noticed something off. My car looked lower. As I got closer, my stomach turned as I realized why. All 4 tires were slashed. I stumbled back, trying to process what I was seeing, my mind racing. Then, a movement from inside the car caught my eye. There was someone crouched in the back seat. For a split second, I was frozen in shock. Then, instinct took over, and I ran. I didn't look back. I just ran as fast as I could down the road. My phone was useless out here, but I had to keep going. I didn't stop until I saw headlights approaching in the distance. Waving my arms like a madman, I flagged down the car and practically collapsed as I explained what had happened. The driver, an older man, looked at me with wide eyes and immediately called 911. Within minutes, the police arrived, and I finally felt a shred of safety returning. They walked me back to my car, guns drawn, but by the time they searched it, the back seat was empty. Whoever had been in my car was gone, leaving behind only a faint, lingering scent of something earthy and damp. They found no trace of Calvin, either, no cabin, no bike, nothing but an eerie, isolated patch of forest. The police documented the slashed tires, and a tow truck came to take my car to a shop in town. As I sat in the tow truck, replaying everything in my mind, one thought haunted me: Calvin, or whoever he really was, had known exactly where I'd be, and he made sure I couldn't leave. It was the summer I turned 12. My parents were traveling out of town for a few days, so they let me stay with my friend, Charlie, at his grandmother's house in a quiet town a couple of hours from where we lived. Charlie and I had been friends since we were 6, so his family was like my second family. His grandma, Ms. Edith, was this kind, soft-spoken woman who always seemed to have fresh cookies waiting for us whenever we visited. Her house, though, was different, old, with creaky floors and walls that seemed to whisper. The house sat on the edge of a large, overgrown park, the kind with dense trees and narrow paths that led who knows where. I always felt a little strange in that place, but it was just one of those old houses you assumed had personality. That night, after a quiet dinner and some card games at the kitchen table, Charlie and I decided to head outside and play in the backyard. We grabbed flashlights, and the two of us thought it'd be fun to play hide-and-seek in the dark. Ms. Edith wasn't thrilled about us playing in the dark, especially so close to the park, but she didn't stop us. Maybe she thought it would be harmless fun. The air was cool, and the crickets were chirping as we ran around, flashlight beams bouncing off trees and bushes. It was a typical childhood thrill, the kind you don't question, until the world around you starts to feel less playful. After a few rounds, it was my turn to find Charlie. I took my flashlight and began searching through the backyard, keeping my voice low, calling his name in a playful whisper. I wandered closer to the tree line, scanning the shadows, half expecting Charlie to jump out and scare me. That's when I saw it. Standing just beyond the first line of trees was a figure, a tall, thin shape, draped in what looked like a filthy, crumpled sheet. It was white but stained in places, like it had been dragged through the dirt, and it was loose, almost shapeless, with 2 holes cut out for eyes and a wider slit for a mouth. I froze, staring, convinced it had to be Charlie messing around. But as I watched, something about it felt wrong. It stood too still, the way someone would if they were trying to watch without being seen. "Charlie?" I called, my voice barely a whisper. I took a step back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I forced myself to look away for a second, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then Charlie's voice came from behind me, barely more than a murmur. "Don't move. Come back. Right now." I turned to see him standing near the back door of the house, his face pale, eyes wide. He didn't look scared in a mischievous, "I scared you" kind of way. He looked genuinely terrified. I didn't think twice. I ran back to him, and we both bolted inside, slamming the door behind us. Charlie and I were both out of breath, and his grandma looked at us, confused. She asked if everything was all right, but we just nodded, too freaked out to explain. She gave us a strange look but let it go, probably thinking we were just boys being boys. That night, as we lay in bed, trying to laugh off what we'd seen, we heard it, a faint noise like a soft creak coming from upstairs. Charlie's grandma had a room up there, and we assumed it was just her moving around. But the sound didn't stop. It was rhythmic, a slow, steady shuffle that seemed to cross the length of the upstairs hallway. We tried to convince ourselves it was nothing, probably just old house noises. Eventually, the creaking stopped, and somehow, we managed to fall asleep. The next morning, Ms. Edith was bustling around the kitchen as usual, pouring us orange juice and toasting bread. But as we sat down, she looked at us with a curious expression. "Did one of you open the window in the living room last night?" she asked. Charlie and I glanced at each other, both shaking our heads. We hadn't even been in the living room. Ms. Edith's face darkened, and she muttered something under her breath before heading to the front room. I heard her let out a small gasp, and when we followed her, we saw it too. A large, muddy sheet was lying crumpled on the floor near the open window, with 3 holes cut out, exactly like the one I'd seen on that figure in the woods. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. I looked at Charlie, who looked just as unsettled as I felt. Miss Edith was visibly shaken, but she kept her composure. She locked every door and window in the house and told us to stay close while she made a phone call. We sat silently, straining to hear her conversation. I couldn't make out much, but I heard her say, "Intruder," and "Police." After she hung up, she told us to grab our things. We were going to stay at Charlie's house for a few days, just until everything was sorted out. The police arrived shortly after, and we watched from the car as they went inside to investigate. Miss Edith didn't say much on the drive to Charlie's house, and we didn't ask any questions. All I knew was that whatever we'd seen, or thought we'd seen, had somehow entered the house. That night, as we tried to sleep in Charlie's room, the events played on a loop in my mind. I kept wondering who, or what, had been in that sheet. The way it had stood, so still, so focused on me, haunted me. What bothered me the most was knowing it had been inside the house, just feet away from where we slept, silent and unseen. The next morning, Charlie's dad told us that the police had found evidence of someone breaking in through the living room window. They didn't take anything or damage anything, just left that sheet behind. They couldn't figure out how long the person had been there or if they were still around. All I knew was that I never wanted to go back to Miss Edith's house again. When my mom and her new husband left for their honeymoon, I got shipped off to my Uncle Ronnie's place. I wasn't thrilled. I was used to spending my summers in the city, not on some secluded farm in the middle of nowhere. I was 16, feeling too old for babysitters but apparently not old enough to stay home alone. Mom didn't really know what to do with me, I guess. Uncle Ronnie's farm was one of those places that looked like it belonged in a dusty old photograph from the early 1900s. He had a big, rambling house that looked like it hadn't seen a coat of fresh paint in decades, surrounded by fields stretching out as far as you could see. It was early autumn, and the crops were nearly harvested, but what stood out the most were these scarecrows scattered around his fields. He'd positioned them at odd angles, probably to make them look extra creepy to keep birds away. They had this strange, unnerving quality about them, like they were half human somehow, with ragged clothes that flapped in the breeze and heads made from burlap sacks. He'd painted crude faces on them, but in a way that made them almost sinister. The first night, after Uncle Ronnie went to bed, I stayed up in the living room, scrolling through my phone and trying to get enough signal to send a text. Uncle Ronnie's place was beyond quiet, the kind of quiet that seemed to press down on you, like the darkness had its own weight. I wasn't used to it, and I was starting to feel a bit on edge. I don't know if it was the atmosphere, or maybe the remnants of that joint I'd smoked earlier, but I just couldn't shake this eerie feeling. Around midnight, I heard something tap against the window. Just a soft little tap tap tap, but in the dead silence, it sounded like gunshots. I froze. Part of me wanted to ignore it, and just go to bed, but another part was curious, or maybe just a little paranoid. When I finally worked up the nerve to glance at the window, there was nothing there. I laughed a little, thinking I was just being paranoid. But then, as I turned back to sit down, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. My gaze snapped back to the window, and that's when I saw one of the scarecrows. It was just standing there, close enough that I could make out the crude, painted features of its face. But then it did something that made my heart skip. It waved. It was slow, a jerky, unnatural movement, like someone puppeteering it with invisible strings. My blood ran cold, and I immediately looked away, telling myself it was just the weed playing tricks on me. Scarecrows don't move. They're literally made of straw and sticks. I went to bed that night with my heart hammering in my chest, convincing myself it was all just my imagination. But the next morning, Uncle Ronnie came to the breakfast table, looking confused and a little worried. "Damn kids," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Can't believe they take all 3 of them." What do you mean? I asked, genuinely curious. Scarecrows, he said, scratching his head. All 3 of them. Gone. Vanished. They're not where I left them. I felt a chill trickle down my spine. I thought about what I'd seen the night before, but kept my mouth shut. There was no way I was going to tell Uncle Ronnie that one of his scarecrows had waved at me. Probably some prank, he muttered, shrugging it off. Kids around here get rowdy around Halloween. But I couldn't shake the memory of that stiff, unnatural wave. Something didn't feel right, but I forced myself to believe it was a prank. What else could it be? That day dragged on slowly. Uncle Ronnie spent hours combing through the fields, but there was no sign of the scarecrows. He seemed agitated, muttering to himself and casting suspicious looks at the neighbors' fields. As for me, I tried to put it out of my mind, but every so often I'd catch myself glancing out the window, half expecting to see one of those twisted figures waving back at me again. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, we heard it. A soft, rhythmic thumping on the front porch. Uncle Ronnie's fork clattered to his plate, and he looked at me with a puzzled expression. We both got up and went to the front door, and the second he opened it, I felt my stomach drop. There, lined up on the porch, were the 3 scarecrows. Their heads tilted in different directions, their painted eyes staring blankly. But what made my skin crawl was the red paint smeared across their faces and hands, dripping down their ragged clothes. It was too dark to see clearly, but it looked disturbingly like blood. Uncle Ronnie cursed under his breath. Damn Halloween pranksters! He spat, though I could tell he was shaken. He stormed out onto the porch, grabbing one of the scarecrows by the arm to drag it off. The moment he touched it, a strong smell hit me, metallic, sickly sweet. I wanted to believe it was just paint, but there was something disturbingly lifelike about the smell. It reminded me of copper, like the smell of blood. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a stupid prank, but Uncle Ronnie seemed just as spooked as I was. We hauled the scarecrows to the edge of the property and dumped them in a heap. Uncle Ronnie promised he'd call the sheriff the next morning. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing those scarecrows standing on the porch, their painted eyes staring, and that awful, red-streaked paint smeared across their faces. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see them waiting there, almost like they knew something we didn't. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I heard it again, that soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from the window next to my bed. I forced myself to open my eyes, to look toward the sound, and there, pressed against the glass, was one of the scarecrow's faces, its painted smile twisted in the moonlight. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just lay there, paralyzed, as it raised one stiff, red-smeared hand and tapped again, the sound hollow and deliberate, like it was trying to get my attention. I don't remember what happened after that. I think I passed out from sheer terror, because the next thing I knew, it was morning, and Uncle Ronnie was shaking me awake, looking more frightened than I'd ever seen him. The sheriff was on the porch, staring at the mess of scarecrows lined up neatly, one by one, outside my window. They were arranged in a row, each one facing my bedroom, each one with that red-smeared face pointed directly at me. The sheriff just scratched his head, muttering something about kids and Halloween pranks. But I saw the look in his eyes. He didn't believe it, not really. And neither did I. When I was around 15, my friends Caleb and Ryan and I had this routine of riding our bikes through town late at night. Our hometown was the kind of quiet, small place where almost everyone knew each other, and the streets were practically empty after dark, so we never worried much about safety. Those Friday night rides became a bit of a ritual, a mix of boredom and that teenage thirst for freedom. One Friday night, we decided to meet up around 11. We'd ride out, loop around Main Street, stop for a bit in the parking lot behind the old movie theater, and then wander the neighborhood. It was past midnight by the time we got to Main, and the whole street was dead silent. No one else in sight save for the soft hum of streetlights and the faint buzz of neon signs and closed-up shop windows. We parked our bikes and sat there, chatting and tossing jokes, trying to spook each other with stories. Then a car pulled up. I remember hearing it before I saw it, just a faint rumble of an engine, and then it coasted into the lot across from us, lights off. That's when things got strange. The car didn't move, didn't even flash its headlights. It just sat there, completely dark, like some shadowed presence watching us. I could barely make out the shape of the driver, but something about the way they were sitting, completely still, with just the outline of their head visible, sent a chill down my spine. Caleb was the first to say what we were all thinking. "You guys, maybe we should go." We tried to play it cool, grabbing our bikes and acting casual, but as soon as we pedaled off, the car pulled out too, following us at a creepy, unhurried pace. Every time we glanced back, it was there, keeping just enough distance to stay half hidden in the night shadows. By the time we reached my house, my nerves were on edge. We quickly ducked into my backyard, parking our bikes in the usual spot behind the shed. My dad was awake, sitting on the couch, so I figured we were safe. We talked for a bit, and Caleb and Ryan decided to head home, assuring me they'd be fine. Once alone, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there. I'd been lying in bed, about to drift off when I heard it, a strange scraping noise from outside. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was the wind or some animal. But then the noise came again, a slow, metallic click-click as if someone was fiddling with the latch on our shed. I got up, moving to the window overlooking the backyard. That's when I saw it. The shed door was slightly open, just a sliver, but enough for me to see the shadows moving inside. My breath caught. I was paralyzed, unable to look away. I went to wake my dad, whispering frantically about someone in the backyard. We grabbed a flashlight and crept outside, hearts pounding. The yard was silent, save for the soft rustle of leaves. My dad threw the flashlight beam over to the shed. It was empty, no one inside, no footprints, just the door hanging slightly ajar and the latch bent as if someone had tried to force it open. The police came the next morning. They found nothing, no fingerprints, no footprints. Whoever had followed us was gone without a trace. But every so often, I'd hear something late at night. A faint click-click from outside my window or by the shed. I never found out who it was, or why they followed us. I'll never forget that November night in the woods, and I don't think Lily will either. It was supposed to be a casual weekend camping trip, something that'd give us a break from our usual routine and let us spend time near her dad's old cabin. It seemed like the perfect chance for us to unwind, but it quickly became anything but relaxing. I can still see it vividly in my mind, and telling it now doesn't make it any less terrifying. We decided to camp not far from her dad's property, just a short hike into the dense stretch of trees where the forest floor was covered in layers of dried leaves, already fallen in that autumn chill. There was something eerie about the place, especially since it wasn't a popular campsite. But we had been there a few times before without incident, so we didn't think twice about it. We set up camp by dusk. There's always something comforting about setting up a fire, pitching the tent, and preparing a simple meal. The warmth from the fire and the silence around us felt like a reprieve from the busy world. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but we brushed it off as one of the perks of being far from civilization. As the night wore on, we sat close to each other, wrapped in blankets, chatting about the kind of stuff that just pops up when you're out in nature with someone you love. The night was pitch black except for the flickering firelight that seemed to dance with the shadows. But soon, we both noticed something that interrupted the tranquility, a sound. At first, it was faint, almost like the distant rustling of animals moving through the leaves. But after a while, it became clear that this wasn't an animal. It was deliberate, and it was getting closer. We both fell silent, listening. Each crackle of the leaves seemed louder, and our eyes strained against the darkness, trying to see beyond the reach of our fire. Then we saw it, a shadow, moving slowly but unmistakably toward us. In the fire's glow, it looked almost human, seated on a log near our fire, just out of our immediate line of sight. Lily and I exchanged a glance, each wondering if the other had seen it too. But before I could say anything, she squeezed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaky but trying to sound assertive. No answer. Only the soft crackling of the fire and the faint echo of our breathing. I stood up, the flashlight in my hand trembling slightly. I shone it in the direction where we'd seen the figure, but the light revealed nothing. There was no one there, no figure, no shadows, just the empty stretch of forest and trees. Trying to shake off the dread, I returned to the fire, but when I looked back at the tent, I froze. Against the thin fabric, cast by the light of the fire, there was the unmistakable silhouette of someone sitting, their heads slightly cocked to one side, like they were just waiting, watching. I couldn't explain it, but it looked like the same shadow, in the exact same posture. "We need to leave," I whispered to Lily, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't argue, she had seen it too. We hastily started packing, but every few seconds my eyes would dart back to the tent, and that shadow never moved. It was as if it was taunting us, daring us to come closer. I can't remember ever feeling fear quite like that, the kind that grips you so tightly you can barely breathe. The minute we were packed, we bolted down the narrow, winding path that led back to the cabin, our feet crashing against the dry leaves. But as we ran, that was when we heard it, the sound that still haunts me. A low, guttural moan, echoing through the trees like the mournful wail of something in pain, or something lost. Then came the sound of branches snapping, like someone, or something, was moving fast behind us. "Run!" I heard myself scream, and Lily didn't need any further urging. We didn't dare look back. Every instinct was focused on reaching her dad's cabin, which suddenly felt like our only chance at safety. We burst through the cabin door, breathless and terrified. We slammed it shut and locked it, as if that thin layer of wood was somehow going to keep out whatever was out there. Once inside, the silence was both a relief and a new kind of torture. We could barely catch our breath, our hearts pounding so loud it felt like they'd echo out into the night. We crept into the bedroom, locking the door behind us. It felt ridiculous to do so, like a scene from some horror movie where the characters think locking a flimsy door will save them from whatever lurks outside. But in that moment, it was all we could do to feel any semblance of security. The night dragged on painfully slow. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of leaves outside, felt like a new sign that something, or someone, was close. At one point, I could have sworn I heard that same low moan outside the cabin, barely muffled by the walls. Lily was too afraid to sleep, and I stayed up with her, listening, waiting, hoping that whatever had followed us had lost interest. Finally, the sun crept over the horizon, casting the first rays of morning light through the trees. With the daylight, we felt some of the fear ease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just outside. Still, we had to go back to retrieve the things we'd left in our hurry. The clearing looked different in the daylight, less sinister but still off. The fire was nothing but cold ashes, and our tent looked untouched, except for the chair we'd seen the shadow sitting on. It was lying on its side, like it had been knocked over after we ran. We didn't say much as we packed up, but we both knew that something had happened that night, something beyond rational explanation. On the drive home, we tried to convince ourselves it was just a prank, maybe some other camper messing with us, but neither of us really believed it. That shadow, that moaning, there was no other way to explain it. We both knew we had seen and heard something real. We were a group of 5, young and looking for something thrilling to break the monotony of military life. There was Caleb, who always had a taste for anything dark and mysterious. Sam, who'd reluctantly go along but was secretly just as excited. Jesse, who was the life of the party and probably the least superstitious. Then there was Harper, who was a little too into ghost hunting for anyone's comfort. And then, of course, there was me, the skeptical one, who usually shrugged off ghost stories as tricks of the mind. We had heard rumors about a road out near Thornton, Colorado, called Riverdale Road. It was supposedly one of the most haunted roads in America. Caleb was the one who brought it up. "I'm telling you, man, people have seen some weird stuff out there," he said, pulling up article after article on his phone. They say there's a whole stretch where cars have randomly broken down, people see apparitions, and get this, there's even a ghost Camaro. It was supposed to be the spirit of a man who had died in a fiery crash back in the 60s or 70s, driving a Chevy Camaro. The legend goes that he was speeding down the road, maybe intoxicated, maybe in a hurry, and lost control. Since then, people claim to see his car appear out of nowhere, following them as they drive through that lonely stretch. Most chalk it up to urban legend, but the descriptions are eerily consistent. A classic, black Camaro with a broken taillight, roaring down the road in the dead of night. I wasn't one to believe in haunted cars or ghostly apparitions, but there was something about the story that drew us all in. That Sunday night, with nothing else to do, we piled into my old Jeep and headed toward Riverdale Road. The drive there was full of nervous laughter and light-hearted chatter. Sam was already regretting it, muttering, "I swear if anything happens, I'm never listening to Caleb again." We just laughed and kept going, with Caleb leading us through the route on his phone's GPS. The road started to wind, the houses grew sparse, and soon enough, the only light came from our headlights illuminating the empty stretch ahead. It was darker out there than I expected, almost as if the sky itself had lowered, closing us in. The air felt heavier, and the trees lining the road seemed to close in like shadowy sentries watching us pass by. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed, maybe not by people, but by something, a lingering presence. At one point, we saw a crude wooden cross by the side of the road. Harper whispered, "Probably a memorial for someone who died here." I wasn't sure if she was just trying to spook us or if she was genuinely nervous, but for once, her tone was serious. As we slowed near the cross, the atmosphere grew unnervingly still. Not a single sound, no crickets, no breeze, just an eerie silence that seemed to hold its breath. That's when we saw it. From around the bend, a car came speeding toward us. It wasn't just any car. It was an old black Camaro, exactly like the one in the stories Caleb had told us. Its taillight was cracked, flickering sporadically, and there was something wrong with its headlights. They were on, but dim, like the car was watching. None of us spoke as it sped past. We all caught a glimpse of it, its glossy black body glinting under the dim moonlight. The car whipped by, fast enough to kick up dust and scatter dead leaves in its wake. But as soon as it passed us, it slowed down and turned around. Now, it was facing us, parked in the middle of the road, its headlights flickering off one by one until it sat in complete darkness. We could barely make out its outline, but I swear I could feel it staring us down, as if daring us to make a move. I snapped out of it and shouted, "Everyone back in the car! Now!" My voice was shaky, but I tried to keep it together. The others didn't need telling twice. We scrambled back into the Jeep, Harper practically jumping over the front seat to avoid being the last one outside. I threw the car into gear, and as I began to pull away, the Camaro's engine growled to life behind us, louder and more menacing than before. I pressed the gas harder, trying to put as much distance between us and that ghostly vehicle as possible. But every time I looked back, it was right there, creeping up closer, staying just far enough to remain a threat. Suddenly, the Camaro's headlights went dark again. It was tailing us without any lights at all, almost blending with the night except for that broken taillight that would flicker just enough to let us know it was there. Every instinct told me to speed up, but Caleb reminded me of the stories. "Don't go over the speed limit," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. "They say it only gets worse if you try to outrun it." Keeping a steady pace was torture, but I did as he said. It was like the road stretched out, becoming longer with every passing second, the shadows deepening on either side. The tension in the car was suffocating. None of us dared to speak. I could feel the presence of that car looming, practically breathing down our necks. I had never been so hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every flicker of the rearview mirror, every crack in the road felt amplified, part of some greater, sinister design. Finally, we reached the end of Riverdale Road. The moment we passed the last streetlight, the Camaro abruptly stopped. I watched in the mirror as it stayed there, idle, its broken taillight flickering one last time before it turned around and sped off back the way it came. disappearing into the dark. None of us spoke for a long time. We sat in silence, breathing heavily, each lost in thought. Eventually, Harper broke the silence. "That was real, wasn't it? That really just happened." Nobody wanted to answer, but we all knew the truth. That Camaro wasn't a figment of our imaginations or an elaborate prank. It was something much older, something bound to that stretch of road, waiting for the next unlucky souls who'd be foolish enough to seek it out. When I was around 7 years old, my family took me to this tiny amusement park outside of town for their big Halloween event. It was called Pumpkin Land. I remember being so excited to see all the decorations, the haunted house, the ghost train, everything. The whole place was filled with laughter, fake cobwebs, skeletons hanging from trees. It was every kid's dream Halloween night. Things took a turn when I wandered off with my dad to find the restroom. After waiting outside for a bit, I noticed he was taking a long time. Being a kid, I got impatient. I glanced around, hoping to spot him coming out. Then I looked back at the restroom door and somehow, he wasn't there. The laughter and screams from the nearby rides started to sound strange. They weren't happy sounds anymore. They felt far away, like echoes in a nightmare. It was around then that I felt someone's presence near me. A man was standing close by, probably in his late 30s or 40s. He had this slightly crooked smile that didn't reach his eyes, and his gaze felt wrong somehow. At first, I thought he might be one of those friendly grown-ups who help lost kids. He asked me if I was looking for someone, and I nodded, telling him I couldn't find my dad. "Oh, don't worry, buddy," he said, his voice low and a little too calm. "I'm sure your dad's looking for you too. How about we check out near the parking lot? He's probably waiting there." I hesitated. Something about his voice, his expression, didn't sit right with me. And then he did something that sent a chill through my tiny, 7-year-old body. He took out a cell phone, put it to his ear, and started talking into it. "I got your son here." "Yep, right by the restroom. I'll bring him to the car." The only problem was, my dad didn't own a cell phone. The moment I realized that, my stomach dropped. I looked up at him, and something dark and silent passed between us. He knew that I knew something was off. But his hand tightened on mine just enough that I felt trapped. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do, and all the while, I felt like I was sinking into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. As he started guiding me toward the gate, I felt panic bubble up inside me. The rides and laughter around me felt like a distant world, too far away to reach. I knew I had to do something, anything, to get away. Just then, I spotted a young woman in a park uniform nearby, holding a walkie-talkie. I called out to her, probably louder than I'd ever yelled in my life, but it felt like my voice was so small and weak. She turned, saw the man holding my hand, and her eyes narrowed. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, looking at the man with a strange, uncomfortable suspicion. He let go of my hand and put on this smile that was somehow both friendly and hollow. "Oh, it's all good," he said smoothly. "I'm just helping him find his dad. We're headed out to the parking lot." I felt my throat dry up as I interrupted him. "My dad doesn't have a cell phone," I blurted, looking straight at her with wide, scared eyes. The woman looked between us, and for a moment, there was this frozen silence. The man's face went blank, like his mask had slipped, and he realized he was caught. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and walked away, quickly disappearing into the crowd. The woman immediately crouched down, her hands on my shoulders, and I finally felt like I could breathe again. She led me to a nearby booth and got on her walkie-talkie, calling for my parents over the park's PA system. Within minutes, my dad came running up, his face a mix of worry and anger. He held me so tight I thought he'd never let go. When my parents heard what happened, my dad went storming off to find security. He demanded to see footage of the man, but as it turned out, the park didn't have cameras near the restroom or the gate. We never saw that man again. Now, as an adult, when I look back on that night, it feels like a near brush with something horrible, a shadow that almost took me away. I still think about that man sometimes, wondering if he'd done that before, if he'd ever succeeded. And every Halloween, when I see kids trick-or-treating or at fairs, I feel that chill run down my spine all over again. I've been a pizza delivery guy for a while now. I work the night shifts. Yeah, I know, not exactly glamorous, but it pays the bills. Most of my shifts are pretty routine, but there was this one night that still keeps me up sometimes. It was just a typical Tuesday, a slow night, maybe 1 or 2 orders every hour. It was around 1 a.m. when an order came in. Nothing unusual, except it was for a house out on Old Mill Road. I didn't even know people lived that far out. It's mostly abandoned farmland and a few rundown buildings, so I figured maybe it was some kid pranking me. I checked the map, grumbling a little. Old Mill Road was barely even a road. It was more like a narrow dirt path winding out into the woods. But I didn't have a choice. I grabbed the pizza, threw it in my car, and set out. The drive felt longer than it should have, mainly because the farther I went, the more the forest seemed to close in on me. My headlights carved out just enough of the darkness to see the road, but everything beyond was pitch black. It was like the trees were looming over me, blocking out the sky. The kind of place you wouldn't go unless you had to. After about 20 minutes, the GPS announced I'd arrived, but when I looked around, all I saw was this one house set way back from the road. It was an old, 2-story farmhouse, probably white once, but now faded and chipped to gray. No lights were on, not even a porch light. It seemed strange for anyone to live there, much less be awake enough to order pizza at this hour. I parked the car and got out, pizza in hand. The house looked even worse up close, windows dark, front porch sagging, and not a sound coming from inside. I walked up to the door, knocked a couple of times, waited. Nothing. No footsteps, no. Just a minute. Nothing but the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. I tried the doorbell, but I didn't hear it ring. It was probably broken. I thought about just leaving the pizza on the porch, but I figured I'd at least try calling them first. So, I went back to my car, pulled out my phone, and dialed the number on the order slip. It rang a few times, then went to voicemail. A woman's voice, calm but kind of strange, just said, "You've reached the Daniels family. We're not available right now, so leave a message." There was something off about her voice, not just the flatness, but the way she said, "We're not available." It almost sounded like she was trying not to say more. I hung up, trying to decide if I should just leave. Then, as I was sitting there in my car, I heard this sound. It was faint, but in the silence, it felt louder. It was like footsteps, maybe from the side of the house. Probably an animal, I told myself, trying to stay calm. Still, it didn't make me feel any better. After a few minutes, I decided to give it one last try. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and walked back to the door. This time, as I lifted my hand to knock, my phone's light caught something in the window. It was subtle, just the faintest glimpse of movement, like someone had been watching me and moved back. My skin prickled. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Pizza delivery?" Silence. I tried knocking one more time, but the door creaked open just a little, like someone had left it unlocked. I backed up a step, flashlight still pointed inside. The beam of light barely cut through the darkness, but I could just make out a staircase leading up and a long hallway stretching into shadow. It was empty, or seemed that way. And that's when I saw it. Just on the edge of the flashlight's reach, at the end of the hallway, there was a figure. Tall, thin, standing perfectly still. He wore a mask, a wolf mask, of all things, but it looked so lifelike in the dim light that for a moment I almost believed it was real. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, watching me. My mind went blank. I backed up slowly, not daring to turn around. As soon as I was back on the porch, I turned and bolted for my car, nearly dropping my phone in the process. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine, half expecting to see him coming after me. But when I looked back at the house, it was dark again, like he'd never been there. I didn't waste any more time. I drove out of there faster than I'd ever driven before, my hands shaking on the wheel. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights following me, but there was nothing. Just darkness. When I finally got back to town, I parked near the police station and just sat there, trying to catch my breath. Eventually, I went in and told the cops everything. At first, they looked at me like I was crazy, but when I mentioned the Daniels family name, they exchanged a look. One of them pulled me aside and asked me to sit down. Apparently, the Daniels family had been out of town for weeks. They'd gone to visit relatives up north and hadn't been back since. Nobody was supposed to be in that house. And then the officer said something that still makes my skin crawl. There had been a series of murders in the area over the last few months, unsolved cases where the victims were found in remote places, each one with signs of ritualistic mutilation. They'd been looking for someone in connection with the murders, someone who, according to some witnesses, wore a mask. The officer looked at me, dead serious. "If you saw him, you're lucky you got out." I left the police station in a daze, feeling like I'd walked into some kind of nightmare. And as much as I wish I could say it's over, I still think about it every time I'm out on a late-night delivery, every time I hear a strange noise. I always look over my shoulder now, always check the mirrors. Because somewhere out there, he's still out there, the man in the wolf mask, watching and waiting in the dark. It was a Friday night, and I was home alone. Rain battered against the windows, and the occasional growl of thunder echoed in the distance. I had just settled onto my worn-out sofa with an old horror flick on the TV, and the dim glow of a single lamp casting eerie shadows around the room. I'd decided to order a pizza for the evening. Something about cold weather, an empty house, and pizza just seemed to fit. I made the call, ordered a large pepperoni with extra cheese, and waited. About 20 minutes later, just as the storm was picking up outside, I heard footsteps approaching the front porch. Perfect timing, I thought. I was starving. I stood up and headed to the door, but something made me pause. Maybe it was the way the footsteps sounded, too slow, too deliberate. I shook it off, assuming it was just my nerves from the storm and the horror movie. As I approached the door, I instinctively looked through the peephole. What I saw made my blood run cold. A man was standing there, but he wasn't holding a pizza box. He was just standing, almost pressed against the door, his face tilted slightly, one eye peering straight into the peephole, as if he was looking right at me. I could see only the top half of his face, shadowed by the dim porch light, but his expression was unsettlingly blank, almost as if he was waiting. I took a step back, my heart pounding. Hello?" I called out through the door, trying to sound casual, though my voice shook slightly. "I'm here with your pizza," the man said. His voice was deep and calm, but there was something off about it. It didn't match the urgency I would expect from a pizza delivery guy trying to stay dry in the rain. Where's the pizza?" I asked, trying to sound natural, like I hadn't just felt a chill run down my spine. For a few moments, he didn't respond. He just kept staring, his eye unblinking in the peephole. Then he shifted slightly, just enough for me to see his other eye. Both were locked onto the peephole, like he was trying to see inside. "It's in the car," he finally answered. I hesitated. Why would a delivery guy leave the pizza in the car and come to the door empty-handed? Something wasn't right. "Look," I said, attempting to sound more assertive. "If you don't have the pizza with you, I'm not opening the door." The man didn't respond right away. I could hear him breathing on the other side, slow and steady, almost too steady. Then, in that same unnervingly calm voice, he replied, "I'll just go back to the car and get it." But he didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes still glued to the peephole. "Listen," I said, my nerves fraying. "I don't know who you are, but if you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police." Finally, he took a step back, his face slipping out of view, and I heard his footsteps retreat down the porch steps. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I turned off the TV and switched off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The only light was the faint glow from the street lamp outside. I took a step back from the door, breathing deeply to settle my nerves. Something still felt wrong, though. I decided to call the pizza place to check if they had actually sent someone. "Hi, I ordered a pizza a little while ago, but there was a man here who said he was delivering it, and well, he didn't have the pizza with him," I explained. The woman on the other end was silent for a moment before she replied. "I'm so sorry, but our driver hasn't arrived at your address yet. He's still a few minutes away." "Are you saying someone else was there?" "Yes," I said, my stomach twisting. "There was a man at my door, claiming he was here to deliver the pizza, but he didn't have it with him." She sounded genuinely concerned. "You might want to call the police." "I don't know who that could have been." I hung up, my mind racing. I locked every door and window I could think of and made sure all the lights were off. Just as I was about to call the police, I heard a noise, a faint tapping at the back door, then a soft jiggling of the handle. My blood turned to ice. I crept quietly down the hallway, trying not to make a sound. As I got closer, I could see the outline of someone through the frosted glass of the door, just a shadowy figure leaning in close, trying to look inside. The handle jiggled again, this time more forcefully. I wanted to scream, but I bit down on my lip and reached for my phone. Just as I was about to dial 911, headlights cut across the driveway, and I heard a car door slam. My real pizza delivery guy had arrived. I ran to the front door and flung it open, waving him inside. He looked startled, but I gestured frantically, trying to get him to understand. He stepped inside, and I quickly shut the door, bolting it behind him. "What's going on?" he asked, looking at me like I was crazy. "There was someone here," I whispered, my voice barely steady. "He said he was you, but he wasn't. He tried to get in through the back door." The delivery guy's eyes widened, and he glanced nervously at the darkened house around us. "Do you want me to stay here until the cops come?" I nodded, too shaken to speak. He pulled out his phone and called 911. We sat in tense silence, listening to the rain pound against the house, both of us flinching at every little noise. Eventually, the police arrived, their blue and red lights flashing across the front yard. 2 officers did a sweep of the property, but they didn't find anyone. They told me it was probably just some guy looking for a quick way in from the rain, but they'd file a report just in case. I thanked them, though I didn't feel particularly reassured. After the police left, I turned to the delivery guy, who was still standing awkwardly in my living room. "Do you want me to wait a little longer?" he asked, clearly just as creeped out as I was. I managed a shaky smile. "No, that's all right. I'll be fine. Thanks for staying." He nodded and left, casting one last wary glance at the house before heading back to his car. I stood alone in the silent, darkened house, every creak and groan of the old building suddenly amplified in the quiet. The rain had let up, but the storm outside seemed to have left something behind, an uneasy feeling that I couldn't shake. Just to be safe, I pushed my dresser in front of the bedroom door before crawling into bed. It was a long time before I managed to fall asleep, and even then, my dreams were haunted by the image of that man's unblinking eye staring through the peephole, watching.